She was 23 years old when she walked away from everything. The parlor with its lace curtains, the piano she had played since she was 6, the suitor her mother approved of, and boarded a steamship headed for the edge of the known world. No one came to see her off except her younger sister, who stood at the dock in Philadelphia and didn't say a word, just held her hand until the gangplank was pulled, then let go. Her name was Constance Adeline Worthington. She had grown up in a red brick house in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the second daughter of a Methodist minister who believed that God was precise, that he called specific people to specific places for specific reasons, and that the worst a person could do was pretend they hadn't heard. She had heard. She would spend the rest of her life wishing, sometimes, that she hadn't. There is a question that follows stories like this one. You've probably felt it. It comes at the end when the facts are laid out and the life is finished and you're sitting with what remains. The question isn't, what did she accomplish? That's easy to answer. The question is harder. Was it worth it? We'll come back to that. The year was 1887. Constance had been corresponding for 2 years with a mission society based in London, filling out their forms, submitting her references, attending their meetings in a drafty hall on Chestnut Street. She was, by every measurable account, ideal. She spoke French. She had studied basic medicine under a retired army physician who was a friend of her father's. She had taught Sunday school for 7 years. She had never been sick a day in her life. The Mission Society sent her to Burma, not because Burma needed her specifically, but because Burma was where they had a gap, and Constance was what they had available, and the machinery of organized mission work in the 1880s did not pause to ask whether the fit was perfect. It sent people where the need was greatest and trusted that God would sort out the rest. She arrived in Rangoon in the autumn. The heat was like nothing she had prepared for. Not the damp heat of a Pennsylvania August, but something deeper, something that pressed against the skin from the inside. She wrote to her father that first week, "The air here does not feel like air. It feels like being held very tightly by something that will not let you breathe." But she stayed. She learned. She hired a tutor, a small, serious man named Yu Mawang, who had worked for British administrators for 20 years and found the missionaries endlessly puzzling. And she sat with him 6 hours a day, drilling tones she couldn't hear and vowels her mouth didn't know how to make. She made mistakes that caused her tutor to cover his face with both hands. She made them again. She made them a third time. And then, one morning in December, she got it right, and Yu Mong looked at her with something she would later describe as reluctant astonishment, and from that moment she knew she would not leave. She had been assigned to a girls' school on the outskirts of the city, run by an older missionary woman who had been in Burma for 30 years and had the kind of certainty that comes from surviving things other people only read about. Her name was Mrs. Fairfax. She was Scottish, blunt, warm in the way that a fire in a cold room is warm, not decorative, but necessary. She looked Constance over when she arrived and said, "You'll do. You're thin though, eat more rice." Constance ate more rice. The girls came from everywhere, the daughters of merchants, of farmers, of fishermen who lived along the river. Some spoke 3 languages, some spoke none that Constance recognized. They ranged in age from 6 to 16, and they watched her with the particular wariness of children who have learned that foreigners come with promises that frequently evaporate. She did not promise anything she couldn't deliver. That was her first rule. She taught them to read. She taught them arithmetic. She taught them, on Friday afternoons when the heat was worst and concentration was impossible, to play simple games that involved numbers and movement and laughter, because she had learned from her father that you can teach almost anything if you first make someone laugh. She was, by the end of her 2nd year, speaking Burmese well enough to tell a story without notes. She was, by the end of her 3rd year, leading the school on her own. Mrs. Fairfax had gone home to Edinburgh for health reasons and not returned, and Constance had stepped into the space without being asked, because the alternative was letting it collapse. She wrote home less and less. Not because she had nothing to say, because what she had to say was becoming harder to translate. In the spring of her 4th year she fell, not metaphorically, literally, down a wooden staircase at the back of the school, in the dark, carrying a lamp that shattered when she hit the ground. She lay at the bottom for several minutes before one of the older girls found her and raised the alarm. Her left ankle was broken. Her wrist was sprained. She had a cut on her forehead that needed stitching and left a small scar she would carry for the rest of her life. Just above the left eyebrow, a comma-shaped reminder that the body keeps records even when the mind tries to forget. She was bedridden for 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, something happened. She noticed it first as a numbness, a patch on her left forearm, roughly the size of her palm, where the feeling was not quite right. She pressed it with her fingernail. Nothing. She pressed harder. Still nothing. She told herself it was from the fall, from the awkward way she'd landed, from the weeks of lying in an unnatural position. She told herself a lot of things, but she was the daughter of a man who believed in precision, and she had spent 4 years living among people who knew what certain things looked like, and there was a part of her, small and cold and very quiet, that already knew. She did not tell anyone for 3 months. During those 3 months, she ran the school, taught her classes, corresponded with the Mission Society, led Sunday services, laughed at the appropriate moments, and carried the knowledge of what was happening to her body like a stone in the pocket of everything she did. Not out of denial, out of a kind of refusal. A refusal to let the thing that was coming be the thing that ended everything. When she finally went to see the doctor, a British physician at the Colonial Hospital who had been in Rangoon for 15 years and had seen this before, he looked at the patch on her arm, and then at 2 others she had found since the first, and then at her face, and he said, "Miss Worthington, I think you should sit down." She was already sitting, he told her. She listened. She did not cry, which surprised him. She thanked him for his time. She walked out of the hospital into the white afternoon light and stood on the street for a long moment, listening to the city, the bells, the carts, the children's voices from somewhere behind a wall, and then she walked back to the school. Leprosy. She had it. What happens next is the part that is hard to explain, not because it's complicated, because it runs against everything the rational mind wants to believe about how the world works. She was told to go home. The Mission Society, when she wrote to them, was kind but clear. She needed medical care. She needed rest. She needed to return to Pennsylvania and be among people who could support her. They were not abandoning her. They were, they said, protecting her. She booked passage. She packed her trunks. She said goodbye to the girls at the school and watched them stand in 2 rows on the path outside and sing a hymn they had learned for the occasion, their voices thin and bright in the morning air. She did not let herself cry until the boat was past the harbor mouth and the coast had blurred to a dark line on the horizon. She returned to Lancaster. Her mother met her at the station with her sister and a neighbor who had brought a covered dish. Her father was not well by then. The heart trouble that would take him 2 years later had already begun its slow work. But he came as far as the front step and held her face in both hands and said, "You look exactly like yourself." She did not tell them for 3 days. When she told them, her mother sat very still for a long time. Then she said, "We will manage," which was what her mother said about everything, and which Constance had spent her life finding alternatively infuriating and beautiful. She saw specialists in Philadelphia. She saw a physician in New York who had studied with someone in Paris, who had published papers on the subject. They told her what the disease would do eventually. They told her about treatments that might slow it. They told her to rest, to be careful, to keep herself away from others as much as practical. She rested, she was careful, and she thought. In the months she spent in Lancaster, the longest stretch of time she had passed in that red brick house since she was 17, she thought more carefully than she had ever thought about anything. She prayed in the way her father had taught her, which was not a quiet and decorative practice, but something more like an argument. Not asking permission, but insisting on understanding. Why? That was the question, not why me. She had no patience for that framing, which seemed to her a way of making the question smaller than it actually was. The question was simply why. The whole of it, the shape of it, the thing that the disease and the timing and the years in Burma and the girls at the school and the face of Yu Maung when she first got the tones right. All of it, together, what did it mean, and what was she supposed to do now? She did not get an answer the way answers come in stories. There was no voice, there was no dream. There was an afternoon in November when she was sitting in her father's study with a cup of tea going cold beside her, and she was reading a letter she had received from one of the older girls at the school. Now a young woman, married, living in a village north of Rangoon, and the letter described, in careful English, a community that Constance had heard of but never visited, a village, miles from anywhere, where the people with leprosy were sent, where they lived apart from everything, where no one went unless they had to, where no one goes unless they have to. She put down the letter. She sat for a long time. Then she went upstairs and began, very methodically, to repack her trunks. Her mother found her at it and stood in the doorway and said nothing for a moment. Then, Constance, and Constance looked up and said, "I know, Mama." And her mother came in and sat on the edge of the bed and picked up a folded shawl and didn't say anything else for a while. Finally she said, "Your father won't try to stop you. I know. Neither will I." A pause. "That doesn't mean I understand it." "I don't understand it either," Constance said. "But I have to go." Her mother smoothed the shawl across her knees. Outside, a cart was moving slowly down the lane. The sound of the wheels on the packed earth, the ordinary sound of the ordinary world continuing. "I will pray for you every morning," her mother said, "before I do anything else. Every morning until I die." Constance went back to Burma. The village was called, in the local language, something that roughly translated as the place of separation. It sat at the end of a path that branched off a road that was itself barely a road. 2 ruts through dense green, perpetually wet, smelling of earth and something deeper than earth. There were perhaps 40 people living there when Constance first arrived, in the spring of 1893. By the time she left, decades later, there would be hundreds. She arrived with 2 trunks, a small medical kit, a Bible in Burmese, and letters of introduction she hadn't needed. Because the moment she appeared at the edge of the clearing, everyone in the village could see, from the way she walked toward them rather than away from them, that she was different from the people who occasionally came to inspect and leave. She stayed. She built a life in that clearing with the same methodical patience she had brought to everything else. She organized the housing, rudimentary at first, gradually more permanent. She established routines, morning prayers that anyone could attend, afternoon clinics, evenings when she read aloud from whatever book she could obtain. She wrote to everyone she had ever known, asking for medicine, for money, for fabric, for tools. She wrote to the Mission Society, and to her church in Lancaster, and to strangers who had heard her story secondhand, and sent donations with notes that began, "I don't know if this will reach you, but..." It reached her. It always reached her. What she gave the people of that village wasn't primarily medicine, though medicine mattered. It wasn't primarily faith, though she offered that daily. What she gave them was the one thing that leprosy, by its very nature, strips away from a person before it takes anything else. She looked at them, directly, without flinching, without the involuntary step back, the careful management of expression, the deliberate maintenance of distance that even well-meaning people couldn't always suppress. She looked at them the way she had been looked at by her father on the platform in Lancaster, the way Yu Maung had looked at her, when she finally got the tones right. With the full weight of an actual person's attention, she knew what that look meant to receive. She had spent years on the other side of it, in doctors' offices, and on the streets of Rangoon, watching people's eyes track to her forearm, and then carefully back to her face. She had learned its absence before she understood its presence. She gave it freely and completely, every day, to 40 people, and then to 100, and then to more than she could count. There were hard years. There were hard seasons within the hard years. In 1898, a monsoon destroyed much of what had been built, and they started over. In 1901, a fever moved through the village and took 11 people, including 3 children, and an old man named Solomon, who had arrived at the clearing on the same day as Constance, and who had, every morning for 8 years, been the first person in the meeting house. She buried them herself, in a small plot she had cleared on the eastern edge of the village, and she stood at each grave and read from the Psalms in Burmese, her voice steady in a way that cost her something she could not name. Her own disease progressed slowly, more slowly than the doctors in Philadelphia had suggested was likely. She lost some sensation gradually in her hands. The movements of her fingers became less precise. She learned to compensate, to grip differently, to hold a pen at a new angle. She adapted with the same matter-of-fact stubbornness she had brought to the tones of Burmese and the stares at the school and the monsoon and the fever and everything else the years had offered her. She never stopped working. She trained women from the village to run the clinic when she was unwell. She trained young men to lead the morning services. She wrote a simple guide, 30 pages, hand-lettered, eventually translated by a visitor from a mission college, on the basic management of the disease, the care of wounds, the prevention of secondary infection. It was used in villages across the region for years after it was written. She never knew this. No one thought to tell her. Letters came from Lancaster. Her father died in 1895, and her mother wrote to tell her in a letter that was 3 sentences long because, as she explained in the next letter, 3 sentences was all she could manage at the time. Her sister married a man who taught history at a small college and had 3 children and sent Christmas photographs every year. The children growing in inches, the faces changing, a family assembling itself in real time on the other side of the world. Constance pinned the photographs to the wall above her desk. She looked at them sometimes, not with regret exactly, with something more complicated, a recognition that the life she was not living was a real life, that it would have had value, that the choice she had made was not the only possible good choice. She had never believed that God required suffering as evidence of faithfulness. She had simply understood, in that study in Lancaster with a cold cup of tea, that this particular suffering was where she was meant to go. The 2 things were different. She held them both. She was 61 when a journalist found her. He had been sent by a Christian magazine in London that was running a series on forgotten missionaries. He was young, recently graduated from Oxford, confident in the way of young men who have not yet been sufficiently surprised. He arrived at the edge of the clearing in the late afternoon with a notebook and a set of prepared questions and the faint, carefully concealed expression of a person who expected to be moved but had not yet been. He was moved, not by what he expected, not by the poverty of the setting or the condition of the patients or the grandeur of sacrifice. Those things he had written into his questions in advance, and writers who write questions in advance often find only the answers they already imagined. He was moved, instead, by something specific. He watched her at the morning clinic. She was dressed plainly, her hair gone entirely white, her hands moving with careful economy over the work of examining a patient. And he noticed that she spoke to the man she was examining, an elderly man, nearly blind, whose face had been changed by the disease until it was almost unrecognizable as a face. In Burmese, not the careful, slow Burmese of a foreigner. The real Burmese, inflected easy, the language of someone who lives inside it. And the man she was speaking to was laughing. Whatever she had said, he found it genuinely funny, and he was laughing the way old men laugh when something catches them off guard, and she was laughing too. The journalist wrote about that moment for the rest of his career. He wrote it first in the article, then in a memoir 30 years later. Then in a letter to his daughter the year before he died, when she asked him who was the most remarkable person he had ever met. He wrote, she was laughing with a man that the world had thrown away, and she was not being kind. She was being his friend. Constance Adeline Worthington died in 1921 at the age of 57. She had lived in the village for 28 years. She had outlived the prognosis by 2 decades and every expectation by more. She was buried in the small plot on the eastern edge of the village, beside Solomon and the 3 children and the others she had buried across the years. The marker was simple: her name, the dates, and a verse she had chosen herself from the 68th Psalm, which in her Burmese Bible read something like, God gives the lonely a home. He leads prisoners out into joy. There was no obituary in any American newspaper. The Mission Society noted her death in their quarterly report in a single paragraph. Her sister, who was the last surviving family member, received a letter from a missionary colleague written in neat Burmese script on thin paper, and translated, imperfectly, by the history professor husband, who did his best with a language he had never studied. The letter said, she made us feel like people who mattered, not because she told us so, because she acted like it every day for 28 years. We did not know what to call what she was. We just knew that the village was different because she came, and the village will be different now that she is gone. We are burying her among us because that is where she belongs. There is a word that gets used sometimes in stories like this one. The word is sacrifice, and it is used as though it means something is lost. As though the life given over to one thing is necessarily taken from something else. But Constance Worthington, in all the letters she wrote across 28 years, never used the word sacrifice to describe what she had done. Not once. She used words like work and hard and strange and beautiful. She used the word grateful with a frequency that struck every person who read her letters as slightly inexplicable, given the circumstances. In her last journal, found after her death in a tin box under her desk, she wrote a single entry for the day before she died. Her handwriting, by then difficult, the letters misshapen by hands that could no longer quite manage their own instructions. The lepers came to me. I came to the lepers. In the end, I cannot tell the difference between those two sentences. I think that is the point. What do you do with a life like that? You do not replicate it. That would miss the point entirely. Constance Worthington's life was shaped by a particular person in a particular moment, hearing a particular call. And the specificity of it is part of what makes it true. You cannot run the experiment again and expect the same results, because the same results were never what this was about. What you do, what we hope you do, having spent this time with her story, is ask the question she asked in that study in Lancaster, with the cold tea and the letter from Burma and the silence that followed. What is the thing I am being asked to do that I am not yet doing? Not the dramatic thing, not necessarily the thing that ends with a grave marker in a clearing in Burma, but the specific thing, the thing that has your name on it, the thing that your particular history and particular wound and particular refusal to look away has been preparing you for. The lepers of Constance's village were waiting for someone to come to them. They waited for years, and then a woman from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, who had fallen down a flight of stairs and discovered in the bruise a calling, came and found them. You are also being waited for. The question is whether you are moving toward the waiting or away from it. We don't know the answer, but we believe you do.